Hi guys! A few weeks ago, I asked you guys what your biggest concerns are with regards to studying literature and English as a subject. So many of you guys responded and I'm really thankful for that. Myself, I'm not really qualified to give you advice because I'm weaker at literature, but today we have a special guest who really knows how English and Lit exams work from the inside out. I'm delighted to introduce Barbara. She's an experienced English and history tutor and also a fellow YouTuber who has really great teaching videos and book summaries for lit texts on her YouTube channel. I've sent her a list of questions that cover topics all the way from how to analyze text and write more persuasively to tips for those who are learning English as a second language. I will be adding timestamps in the description box below, so feel free to jump to the questions that are most relevant to you. Without further ado, let me hand over the time to Barbara to introduce herself.
Hello and bonjour to my fellow French speakers. My name is Barbara and I'm a teacher, but I'm also the founder of First Rate Tutors, and essentially First Rate Tutors is a collective of different teachers, including myself, so I'm an English and history teacher, but also maths teachers and science teachers. And what we do is we offer lots of free revision videos on subjects from English to history to maths and even science on our channel, which is First Rate Tutors. But also you can visit our website if you're looking to take it one step further, especially if you're studying your GCSEs or your A-levels, because on our website you find lots of revision papers that you can purchase, as well as model answers, especially for things like English and history, as well as different revision materials and worksheets that you can use to help yourself when you're studying, say, for either your GCSEs or for your A-levels. So do make sure you check out our website, also called firstratetutors.com. Now, I'm super excited to be collaborating with Gutsy studygirl, and I'm really excited to be answering some of the questions, particularly from your perspective as a student. So as I mentioned, I'm a teacher, and often I don't necessarily get to hear some of the more candid questions that students might have for me. So I'm really excited to be answering these questions from the perspective of both an English and history teacher. So let's get started. Now, the first question is, what do you think is the biggest mistake that students make when studying for English language or English literature? Now, at the risk of sounding a little bit cliche, as most other teachers do, I would say the biggest mistake is leaving it all to the last minute. Now, what I mean is, obviously this is a very typical tactic that students use. They leave it all until revision time or until exams time to, for instance, get on top of maths, just memorizing lots of stuff. Same for English. However, this is a massive mistake when it comes to English, because especially with English literature, where you have to study 100 plus Shakespeare pages of Macbeth, for instance. So this is Shakespeare, or Romeo and Juliet. Or if you have to study lots of novels, which are in excess of 100, 200, even 300 pages, you cannot do this in a week. You think you can, you think you're Superman, you think you're different, but you cannot do this. Now, I know a lot of students, especially those who are not that passionate about things like English, might leave this till last minute because reading stuff like this during the school year can just feel a little bit daunting. So what I usually suggest for my students, at least, is try and make a habit of at least reading just simply 5 pages a day. So create like a revision timetable, create a revision schedule very early on in the year, to be honest, and just read 5 pages. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. You even think, hang on, I'm going to read like 300 pages. 5 pages doesn't really sound like it's moving the needle. It is if you do that every day, and as you're reading it, use a pencil, underline key quotations as you're doing it, because number one, you're making a habit of reading, and you might find over time you become faster in reading. You know, maybe initially it takes you 30 minutes to read 5 pages. Over time it takes you 10 minutes, therefore you're able to read 10 pages, and so on. And that's how people even become faster readers. So really, honestly, don't leave it all to last minute. You can't do this with English literature texts. You will get buried in revision, and ultimately you'll just find that you're going to give up. You're going to get into the exams not really having read very much and feeling a little bit blind when you're answering these questions. So in all honesty, at the risk of sounding very cliche, I think leaving it all till last minute might work with stuff like maths maths and science where you just simply need to memorize certain things, certain equations and so on, but you can't do this with English. And really try your best to break down something that's very daunting, like reading a very long piece of text, into something more manageable. And then, for example, if you set yourself a reading target of just 5 pages a week, every single day within a week, of course, not just 5 pages within a week, but 5 pages in a day, you're going to move the needle a lot more. Now, the second question is, what advice do you have for those who struggle to analyze text, especially for English, of course? Now, I have 4 different pieces of advice when it comes to that. The first is when you are struggling to analyze a text. For example, let's say you are studying Wuthering Heights. This is a fairly popular book, especially at A-levels, and this can be a very daunting book for some students because it's in excess of 300 pages. Or even, for instance, if we look at some Shakespeare texts which are taught even earlier than A-level, everybody who sits GCSEs especially has to learn Shakespeare. Now, the first piece of advice I would say is that begin by learning what the plot is. Go and find spoilers, go on YouTube, visit channels like mine, First Rate Tutors, learn about this text. So for example, if you're studying Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, even before you complete the entire play, go on YouTube, Google Romeo and Juliet, First Rate Tutors, watch it, learn about the plot, characters, themes and so on, so that you already have a clear idea of what the play is about, or what the novel, so for example, going back to my original example, Wuthering Heights, what this novel is about, who are the key characters and so on. Now, this is tied to the second piece of advice, because now with this in mind, going back to my first advice with the first question, set yourself a reading target of at least 5 pages a day on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Maybe you can give yourself the Sunday off. So you firstly already know what the play or the novel is about. Secondly, as you're reading every single day at least 5 pages of either that play or the novel, you are now starting to understand the details, the nitty-gritty in terms of what the different characters have said to each other, and you're just familiarizing yourself with the text. The third thing is make sure you are reading it with pencil, right? So every single day when you're reading your 5 pages a day, you are underlining things that stand out to you just with a pencil. So have a pencil, underline the key things that stand out to you in the 5 pages that you read a day. And finally and fourthly, the reason why these things that you've underlined stand out to you is because there's probably a literature technique that's been mentioned. Maybe there's some alliteration, maybe there's a metaphor, maybe there's a rule of 3 that say Shakespeare has used or another author has used that you're studying. So go back over what you have underlined and think, okay, I've underlined this. This actually is interesting because perhaps alliteration is used here to make it really stand out to me. And really that's essentially the process to follow when analysing these texts, because this is the process of analysis. You read something, you underline something that stands out to you, then you question yourself, you say, hang on, this must stand out to me for a reason. It's probably because of a literature technique, and this literature technique is trying to emphasize a certain meaning. If they use alliteration here, maybe it's trying to create some kind of impact, it's forceful. Maybe if they use empathetic fallacy, which is where the weather reflects the character's moods, maybe this is trying to create a sense of foreboding and negative sense and so on. And really that's simply it when it comes to analysing texts. Now the third question is, some students have difficulty writing fluently and persuasively when writing essays or even presenting a convincing text. How can they improve? Now, this is a really, really good question, because not only does it apply to studying just English simply, especially English language, for instance, writing non-fiction text, things like newspapers, speeches, even normal regular essays. However, this is also really useful as a skill to develop for other areas, other disciplines. If you're writing, for example, a thesis, for instance, if you're writing anything where you have to convince people to see things from your perspective and even maybe presenting it as a speech. Now, this is a common issue when it comes to writing persuasively and presenting persuasive texts. And what I would suggest is to consider 5 elements to always include. Now, if you include these 5 elements, I can almost guarantee you that not only if you're doing English will you get top marks for this persuasive piece of writing, but even in other areas when you're presenting something that really requires other people to see your perspective, you will be able to really convince people to see your point of view. Now, these 5 elements are, firstly, figurative language, and I'm going to go into what that means. The second element is anecdotes. The third is examples. The fourth is statistics. And the fifth element is counter-arguments. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to give you an example. So let's say you have a question in English language relating to newspaper writing, so you need to make something persuasive. You've been asked this question. Social media is bad for you. Write a newspaper where you respond with your perspective. Okay, so the question is, social media is bad for you. You're presenting a persuasive argument for or against this view. Now, I'm going to take the view that social media is good for you, and I'm going to produce a persuasive style of text relating to and supporting why I believe social media is still quite good for you. So, you begin your argument. There's a lot of information in the news and a lot of people who believe social media is quite damaging. However, I disagree. I believe that social media like Instagram, TikTok and Twitter is really good for you, and it causes more good than harm in the world. Now, that's my first point, and I don't know if you've noticed, but I've already used figurative language. Figurative language is essentially using things such as alliteration, rule of three, which I've used in that example. I've mentioned Instagram, TikTok and Twitter. Also, figurative language includes things like similes, metaphors, sibilants. This is all stuff that makes your writing more persuasive, more interesting, fluent and eloquent, even things like repetition. So let's go back to the example. So I've already used number one, figurative language, in my argument to support my view that social media is good for us. I'm going to continue. Now, social media is really, really important, and indeed, social media changed the life of Kate from Sheffield. Now, Kate used to be a very shy teenager. However, she started an Instagram account which essentially provided a platform for different teenagers around the world who suffered from shyness and bullying. And Kate today is a very confident teenager who felt that Instagram, and especially her Instagram page, has really changed her life. Now, this is what we call an anecdote. An anecdote is an interesting example which is very relatable of an individual or an event that we can use to not only bring a lot of color to our example, but also point to a really specific individual that, you know, this can be used to support our argument. Now, my example in arguing that social media is really good, I've pointed to a teenager called Kate, of course I made them up, who has an Instagram account and she feels like it saved her life. So that's the second element that's gone into my persuasive piece. So firstly, I've used examples relating to figurative language. I began with really good figurative language. The second, I've used anecdotes. So let's continue. Furthermore, other forms of social media include YouTube and WhatsApp, and these forms of social media have enabled people globally to really connect, and this shows that social media is really powerful in connecting millions of people together. Now, that example is the third element, which is just simply examples, giving lots of different examples in my case of different types of social media. So I've used YouTube and WhatsApp. So let's continue. Furthermore, a study by Oxford University found that 70% of people who were surveyed who had one form of social media which has been mentioned felt that their quality of life has improved. Now, that's the fourth element that I've included, which is a statistic. I've mentioned Oxford University. Of course, this is a made-up statistic, but essentially what this statistic does is it now further convinces you. Not only have I pointed to a particular individual, not only have I used just a simple example, not only have I also used figurative language, I've also shown statistics and studies which support my perspective. So this is really now convincing you. Now, the final piece is counter argument, because when you're writing something persuasive, you can't just present just one perspective. You need to show that you've considered why some people might disagree with you. So let's continue with the example. That being said, there are many people who disagree with me. Many parents, for example, would point to the children who are addicted to their phones, that stay in their rooms all day and only communicate with other people who they don't know around the world, rather than making physical friends with people who they go to school with. Furthermore, some other parents have mentioned that the children have actually fallen behind in their studies as a result of spending too much time on social media. In spite of these evils that social media can bring, I still believe that social media is really, really powerful, and it does more good than harm. And it's been a key catalyst for the growth of lots of people, including teenagers. Now, I've ended my argument by essentially including a counter argument, a counter view. What the counter argument means is you're considering why some people might disagree with you, you're balancing your argument a little bit, and you're still, after you consider these counter views, the reasons why some people might not disagree with you, might not agree with you, you then show, in spite of all of this, I understand that, there's some people who feel social media is really bad. I still believe it's really good. So essentially, those 5 elements are the major things that you should consider when you're writing a persuasive piece of text. Always ask yourself, does it include these 5 things? Does it have figurative language? Does it have an anecdote? Does it have examples, statistics? And finally, have I also included counter arguments? And I really guarantee the more you practice, the better your writing will get, and you will always get top marks if you make sure that your persuasive writing includes this. Now, the 4th question is, for those who don't enjoy studying English, do you have any tips on trying to make it more interesting? Yeah, I do have tips. In fact, I have 2 tips in order to help you, especially if you don't really love English, make it more manageable and even maybe more enjoyable as you're studying it. Now, the first tip is actually, if you're studying a classic text, these tend to be the hardest ones to wrap your mind around. So classic texts, the Charles Dickens text, Mary Shelley, and so on. There's likely to be a film adaptation that's been made of it. That's why it's called a classic text. Everyone loves it. It's been around for a long time. So there's actually very likely a film version that exists. So I would say, in line with what I've mentioned before, which is find some spoilers, actually watch the film version before you study it, or even whilst you're studying it, because what this does is it makes it more manageable, it makes it more relatable, and even if the film adaptation sometimes they change what happens in the story, you generally get a general idea of the storyline. Now, I did this myself, and I know it's going to sound really bad, but I actually studied Frankenstein by Mary Shelley for my A-levels. Now, to be honest, even if this sounds really terrible, this book really bored me to tears when I was studying this for my A-levels many years ago. So what I actually did is I watched the 1935 film adaptation. It's called The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, it had a few elements that were fictionalized. However, what I found is just watching it gave me a general idea of the story, and it helped me follow this novel much more easily. So that's the first tip I would have, which really makes studying English, especially studying the literature side, which is way more wordy, much more manageable. The second tip I have is try to get a study buddy. Now, this is a bit of a slippery slope because you have to be careful with who you choose. You have to choose another student who's actually quite serious about what they want. Now, the reason why I would suggest getting a study buddy, if you find other students, maybe 1 or 2 other friends of yours who are quite serious about also getting a good grade in English, is that this can be amazing for morale, especially when you go to library, when you don't feel like it. You can almost be each other's accountability partner, but also you can split up tasks. So for example, if one of you is studying, say, Frankenstein, they can be in charge of creating revision cards for that, and somebody else, of course you need to obviously study both texts, but someone else who has to study, say, Wuthering Heights, they can create revision cards for that. So whilst you're both familiar with the text, you split up the different tasks you have to do, and also you can test each other. So those would be my 2 tips for making English more manageable, especially if you don't love it. Number 1, try and watch the film adaptation. Number 2, get a study buddy. Make sure they're serious. Make sure they're, you're not going to go to the library and start messing about. And just use a study buddy and, find somebody who you can both rely on for morale and just to help split up some of the tasks. Now, the 5th and final question is, do you have any tips for writing and speaking better for those who are learning English as a second language? Now, this is a really good question, and actually what I'm going to do is borrow from some of my own learnings when I was learning how to write and speak French fluently. Now, the reason why I had to learn how to write and speak in French is because when I was in university, I also studied in Paris. I went to Sciences Po, Paris, and I studied part of my university studies in French. Now, by the time I went to Paris, I had a very basic beginner understanding of French. Honestly, I could barely speak any French. And what I found can actually be applied in terms of learning English, in terms of learning any other language as a second language. Now, the first tip, which I learned from learning French, but I believe people who are learning English as a second language should try to apply, is actually try to listen to lots of music and lots of artists who produce good and often catchy music in English. Now, I did this when I was in France, and maybe this can reveal a little bit my age. When I was in Paris, I used to listen to a lot of music by a guy called MC Solar. So he's a French artist, and I found that listening to his music, not only was it really entertaining, but actually because it was so catchy, I started learning bit by bit lots of new words, lots of even ways to conjugate certain words. Sometimes, of course, with some of this music, you learn also slang, but that's actually really helpful because when you're out and about, for example, when I was in Paris and I was out and about, I was also able, when I was talking and communicating with people, to understand kind of their slang. Now, my recommendation, for instance, if you're getting a UK qualification or if you want to learn the English style of speaking, would be to actually listen to an artist who I personally really love called Adele. Now, why I would recommend her is not simply because I love her music, but actually, firstly, she doesn't rap, for instance, which can be really rapid to follow. She sings actually in a very slow pace, and she also, the intonation of the way she speaks her music it's very easy to catch. So I would suggest listening to British artists, and of course also the way she pronounces. So again, if you're in the UK or if you want to get a UK qualification, you probably also want to get acclimatized to the English accent. So I would suggest listening to music, because when I was learning French, that's one of the ways that I found really profoundly helped me when I was getting used to acclimatizing and actually learning how to pronounce things, learning different words. The second tip, depending on what your native language is, if you're an Italian speaker, if you're a Portuguese speaker or whatever, think of the different best-selling books which you have read in your own language. And then what you should do, because you've maybe read it, you really enjoyed that best-selling book, find the English adaptation. And the good thing about English is because it's almost seen as a universal language, most best-selling books have been translated into English. Now, what I would suggest, already you know that story in your own native language, purchase the English version, read it, because you can follow it more. You might not be able to follow the specific words used, but broadly speaking, you're able to just follow and really absorb the writing in English. Now, again, going to my example, I really loved reading the short stories of a French author and poet called Guy de Maupassant. So all I simply did was read his French writing, and that really helped me familiarize myself with more ways of writing in French. And of course, French writing can be very complex. There's different ways of writing different things, and of course also the verb system can be quite complex. So also reading something which I already enjoyed, but the French version helped me really start seeing how to write more formally. Now, the final thing I would say is also it just comes down to a case of just memorization. So again, going back to my example, when I was learning French, the conjugation and the verb system is massive. There's so many verbs to learn, so many conjugations and so on. English fortunately doesn't have as many, but there are 12 tenses you have to learn. There are lots of different verbs you have to learn. You simply just need to read them and memorize. So just memorize, memorize, memorize. And I would say all those three put together, of course, you need to invest a lot of time, but those are the three things I would say, speaking directly from my experience as somebody who went from not speaking any kind of French, from being totally lost to actually not only sitting part of my degree in French, but actually being a fluent French speaker. These are what really, really helped me. So I hope all of that information helped. I'm super excited to have had this collaboration with Gutsy Study Girl, and thank you so much for sending me these questions. I hope that they're going to help somebody out there who might be having some struggles with their learning. But also make sure, if you are studying subjects like English, history, or even if you have an interest in things like maths, just visit our channel. Go to First Rate Tutors, just type that in, you'll find our channel, and make sure you pass by and say hello.
I hope this video helps you to enjoy studying literature more and more. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions or requests for future videos. Happy studying, and see you in my next video!